Welcome to World Talk Brief.
Okay, so here's what's on our radar today. We're tracking a tense military standoff in the Persian Gulf, a very fragile winter truce in Ukraine, and a really historic integration deal in Syria. Then we'll pivot to a major leadership change at the U.S. Federal Reserve, a geopolitical showdown at the Panama Canal, and finally, a deep crisis unfolding in Minnesota.
All right, let's dive right into our first story. In the Middle East, where things are getting pretty heated. The United States has moved what President Trump is calling a massive armada into the Persian Gulf, and that's seriously cranking up the pressure on Iran. And the president isn't mincing words. He's making it crystal clear that this isn't just some routine patrol. It's a deliberate show of force, sending a powerful message to Tehran, especially at a time when Iran is dealing with its own internal challenges.
And we are talking about some serious hardware here. The star of the show is the USS Abraham Lincoln, a nuclear-powered aircraft carrier. But it's not alone. It's got destroyers packed with Tomahawk cruise missiles, and it's all backed by B-52 bombers in Qatar and F-15E fighter jets in Jordan. That's a 360-degree threat.
So how is Iran responding? Well, they are not backing down. They've come out with a direct and pretty defiant message of their own. Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi put it bluntly, saying their fingers are on the trigger.
And these are not just empty threats. Iran's Revolutionary Guard has sent out hundreds of its small, fast-attack missile boats to swarm near the U.S. carrier group. It's a classic asymmetric tactic, right? They know they can't go toe-to-toe with the U.S. carrier, but they can threaten to choke off the Strait of Hormuz, a critical artery for the world's oil supply. So the bottom line is, this standoff is happening in one of the most militarized waterways on the planet, where one wrong move could trigger a conflict with huge global economic fallout.
All right, let's shift gears from a hot conflict zone to one where, believe it or not, the weather is forcing a pause. As the war in Ukraine enters its fourth year, an absolutely brutal cold snap is creating a temporary, and I mean very temporary, lull in the fighting.
Just look at that number. We're talking minus 30 degrees Celsius. That's dangerously cold. And for the millions of civilians who have no heat because Russia systematically targeted the power grid, this is a full-blown humanitarian disaster in the making. So, because of this crisis, President Trump says he personally went to President Putin and asked for a one-week pause. But the Kremlin is telling a slightly different story. They're saying, yes, a request was made, but the pause is only until February 1st, and they're framing it as a way to create favorable conditions for negotiations. See the difference?
And that difference, that little gap in the story, tells you everything you need to know about the level of trust here, which is pretty much zero. Ukraine has agreed to halt its own strikes in return, but this whole thing feels incredibly shaky. It might look like a step back from the brink, but let's remember, it was forced by a humanitarian crisis, not a diplomatic breakthrough.
Okay, from a fragile truce to a conflict that just might, be heading towards a real resolution. We're talking about Syria. After years of brutal civil war, the Syrian government and the Kurdish-led Syrian Democratic Forces, the SDF, have signed a truly comprehensive integration agreement.
And this isn't just a simple handshake deal. It's a really detailed step-by-step roadmap to basically put the country back together. It starts with the ceasefire, then government forces deploy, and you even have the SDF brigades being folded into a new division of the National Army. It also covers merging civil institutions. I mean, it's really a plan for total reunification.
And you can tell how big of a deal this is by how officials are talking about it. The U.S. envoy to Syria, Tom Barrack, is calling it a profound and historic milestone on Syria's path to finally finding some stability.
So yeah, this is a massive development for the region, and it could finally close a really painful chapter of the Syrian civil war. All right, now let's switch from the battlefield to the boardroom, because there's a huge shakeup happening at the U.S. Federal Reserve.
President Trump has picked a new person to lead the Fed, Kevin Warsh. Now, Warsh is known as a monetary hawk. And what does that mean? Well, basically, it's someone who's usually in favor of higher interest rates to keep inflation from getting out of control.
And this is where it gets really interesting, because Warsh represents a huge change from the current chair, Jerome Powell. Warsh is a close economic advisor to the president. Powell, he's reportedly being targeted by a criminal probe. And while Warsh has historically been a hawk, recently he's been pushing for lower rates, which is exactly what the president wants. The market sees this as a total regime change at the Fed, which has traditionally been independent.
So why does this matter so much? Because this isn't just about numbers and interest rates.
This nomination could completely reshape America's economic policy. And it brings up this fundamental, really critical question about whether the world's most powerful central bank can actually stay independent from political pressure.
Okay, staying on the theme of global economics and power plays, let's head down to the Panama Canal, where a court ruling is making some serious waves. Panama's Supreme Court just annulled the contract for a Hong Kong-based company, CK Hutchison, to operate two really important ports right at the canal.
And just to give you a sense of the scale here, the Panama Canal is a massive deal. We're talking about 5% of all global maritime trade passing through this one narrow waterway. Control of the ports at either end is a very big deal.
So you have this decision, and now everyone's drawing their battle lines. Panama's court says the contract was unconstitutional. The Hong Kong company calls that baseless. China is vowing to protect its businesses. And the United States? Well, Washington is pretty happy about this, since it pushes back on Chinese influence in its own backyard.
So let's be clear, this is about more than just a port contract. This is geopolitics, plain and simple. It's a direct shot at China's huge Belt and Road initiative in the Americas, and it could very easily spark a much bigger diplomatic showdown.
And for our final story today, we're coming back to the United States, to a city in crisis. Minneapolis has become the center of a national firestorm after federal immigration agents were involved in 2 fatal shootings this month.
Let's just walk through the timeline. On January 7th, Renee Good, a 37-year-old mother, was shot and killed in her vehicle. A couple of weeks later, on January 24th, Alex Preddy, an ICU nurse, was also fatally shot. He was filming a protest with his phone. And since then, the city has just erupted in widespread protests and even a general economic strike.
And a huge part of the outrage comes from the official story just not matching what some people say happened. Alex Preddy's family put out a statement saying, and I'm quoting here, "Alex is clearly not holding a gun. He has his phone in his right hand, and his empty left hand is raised above his head."
But the story gets even more complicated. The Department of Homeland Security, the federal agency that oversees both ICE and Border Patrol, has now stepped in, and they have blocked local police from investigating either of these fatal shootings. And that action leaves the city, and really the whole country, with this huge unanswered question. When you have this kind of clash between federal and local authorities, who is really on the hook for getting to the truth? Who ensures there's transparency and accountability? Subscribe to World Talk Brief for more clear, thoughtful explanations. World Talk Brief, news explained without the noise.